We're at SINS21, the social implications of national security. We're with Roger Clarke, Professor Roger Clarke, who has an affiliation with ANU and also the University of New South Wales. He is the father of data valence, and he was our first keynote speaker at SINS1, which was called the Research Network for a Secure Australia back in 2006. And he later spearheaded a number of articles and special issues stemming from the workshop. We're very grateful that you're back to give our big closing summary of the day, Roger. Thank you for making time and welcome to our beautiful audience.
Thank you, Katina. Can you give me the thumbs up if I'm audible? Good, thank you. Are my slides visible as well? Good, thank you. And thank you for reminding everybody that I've got a grey beard. How long ago was that first one? I'm going to continue the somewhat negative angle here because I think a few more things need to be said in addition to all the very nice things that have been said, as everybody's been so pleasant to one another all day. Yes, of course, there are good things about cybersecurity. Yes, there are, even with more qualifications, good things about AI here and there. What we have got to do is spend a lot more time understanding the downsides and managing them, and we're not doing enough of it. Have I got slide 2 on screen? Good, we're away. First few points have to do with artificial intelligence. We've got to go back and remember its origins. It's a conjecture. It was in 1955 and it is now, and it's not showing many signs of going away from being a conjecture. And several of the points made in Jaws' documentary just now confirmed some of those concerns. It's come, it's gone, it's had its winters. At the moment, I wouldn't say it's going through an upswing. It's at the top of an upswing in the hype cycle. There's a range of current foci. The one that's obviously most pertinent to what we're talking about in this context is the AI ML arena. And we have to understand the nature of the dominant form of machine learning that's in use at the moment, which is artificial neural networks. They come from a long time ago. They had a previous surge and they are having another surge now, and it has something to do with the power of processors that are available to researchers. And there's simplified ways of looking at it. I don't know whether highlighting comes up. No, not if you do it that way. But that last point is not my manufacture. It's somebody who's actually selling artificial neural networks, but it conveys some of the simplification of ideas that people come up with when they're trying to talk about complex technologies. The problem with artificial neural networks is that, unlike previous approaches to producing software, there isn't a careful analysis of a solution or a problem domain, which is what occurred in the previous generations, or what occurred when we were developing software using previous generations of software development tools. All that we got, or all that we need to have at the minimum, is just lists of input variables and output variables, and that's your average automated network. If you want to go a little bit further and have some intermediating variables, then it gets called deep, which seems like a bit of an overcall, but let's say less shallow. But this is not an active modeling process. It's the availability of variables, the availability of data that drives the process. So relationships to the real world haven't been defined in advance and planned by analysts. They happen on the basis of availability of data. So immediately think in terms of correlation rather than causality, etc. And there's far too little done in the way of auditing of that relationship once a model is established and is running. So that links into the problem of empiricism, which has always been a partner with theory, and suddenly we're casting it adrift and treating it as though it was an end in itself and powerful in its own right. There's all sorts of assumptions that are implicit in here. The one I particularly wanted to draw attention to, yes, the close model correspondence with reality. That was the theme of what Jaws' material was on about. Look, in situations where we've got simplicity rather than complexity, a real world system, where we've got a fair bit of structure in the models that we have of those real world systems, we've got stability of phenomena, we've got contexts in which there's little in the way of value ladenness and indeed value conflict. In those situations, well, maybe we can make some real progress with artificial neural networks. But real life with people in it, I really have to express serious concern about people who blindly tip into these kinds of techniques. Now, this, of course, has all been said many times before. There's been a series of people. I think I tracked down the original in the 1954 book, which was a very famous book when people like me went to university. Probably died a death by now. And I'm particularly proud of that graphic because you'd be amazed how few pictures of torture equipment actually contain digits. Think about it. Now, beyond the question of torturing data for long enough, there's also the issue of torturing data hard enough, and there's also the issue of torturing in secrecy. And all of those are features of artificial neural networks. So in a recent paper I did looking at how we might come up with responsible processes to apply AI, there's a series of problems and challenges that we've got to address. There's a large number of threats, which if you try to structure them and in a way that will enable us to address them, that's the minimum I could reduce it to. One that has been pushed a bit earlier during the day was the opaqueness of the inferencing process. The words that Vanessa Teague used for that were transparency before trust. Sums it fairly well. It's got to be a given. It is a precursor to accountability. You can't audit what you cannot read about and cannot analyze. So we've got an increasing level of understanding of what's wrong and what the threats are. Unfortunately, we're not doing much about it. A little while ago, I did a study of 30 of the then available sets of principles for responsible AI under varying different names from many different organizations. And what I did was to extract every one of the ideas that I could find and then shuffle them into something that resembled guidance for organizations. I then did the very nasty thing of measuring each of the 30 back against the master set, and I've then applied that master set of 50 principles. I've used that as a basis for evaluating a number of other subsequent proposals. So those 10 are the themes within which the principles are gathered. An example is of number 1. There's a set of 9 statements in there. I'll just highlight a couple of them. The idea of demonstrating the achievability of postulated benefits doesn't actually appear in any of them, and I had to dress it up, calling it a precondition because I was writing a formal paper, when actually it's either missing or at best implicit, and I find that extraordinary. We then look at the question of conducting impact assessments, which is visible in, would you believe, 7 of the 30. The idea that 23 of 30 sets of guidelines could overlook the idea that we might need to think about what the impact would be of the application that we were considering, I just find astounding, but that is how it stands at the moment. The best of the 30 sets that I evaluated, and the best that I've seen so far, only achieved 74%. 37 of the 50, and that's the European Union's guidelines, which of course are still only guidelines. They're not a legal requirement. So we've got a serious lot of things to do. We've got to confront the fact that we are dealing with a technology in AI which is capable of causing considerable harm, and we're not taking the care, the caution that we should. The precautionary principle is being ignored. It has made some progress in the environmental arena. It hasn't yet in an area that it needs to, which is AI. Now, AI is one thing, and now we've got to think about the cybersecurity application area. What is it that it applies to? Now, first, I've got a slide that I picked up or that I developed by looking for a range of organizations' definitions to find out what scope they think cybersecurity is concerned with. So we continually see hardware, software, data, systems, networks, programs. Once among the ones I found are the services that IT provides. It was actually in the Wikipedia definition of all places. And once I came across the users of those services as being part of the target area for cybersecurity. When I look at Pat Scannell's slide from earlier today, I find something that's has got close correspondence with the narrower of those definitions. And I ask questions about, well, hang on, who's this for? Is cybersecurity only about protecting the hardware and the software? Is it only about protecting the hardware, the software, plus the data that runs in them? Or does it go further than that? And of course, many of the conversations do actually extend to the organization, as arguably implicitly PATS does. But how about external users beyond the employees of the organization? How about usees, who are the individuals and, well, entities, I should say, I guess, who are affected by systems without necessarily being users of them themselves? And on beyond that, there are further onion rings of stakeholder groups. And hence I kept quiet when we were trying to list stakeholders earlier on today, because I'd have been trying to impose this structure on it. So my experience has been that when conversations are held amongst any number of people, but even as few as 3, the conversation usually goes past. Individuals are talking quite differently about things because they have in mind different scope definitions. And until we can get some agreement on what it is we're talking about, we are going to be confused. Now, the last little bit that I wanted to run was my own preferred approach to looking at regulatory forms. You've seen a different version of this earlier on today in one of the keynote speeches. At the deepest level of nesting on the form of diagram I'm using here, there's systemic governance. I think it's important we not overlook the fact that there are some natural forms of regulation, and sometimes we build on those. And the area of infrastructural regulation is important in the IT industry, because we can design our technology so that it at least leans us towards doing things well, rather than automatically tempting us into doing things badly. And then up at the top, there's formal regulation of the legal kind, and a few things in between. The main block in between is this mythology of self-governance, the very idea that wolves would regulate sheep and do it for the benefit of the sheep is nonsense that has been perpetrated time and time again. I'm in industry associations as well as professional associations. I've been self-employed for 25 or 30 years. I think I understand the world out there, and I'm a wolf. And self-governance is hard to impose on oneself. There needs to be a context that causes me to be motivated. So what I argue for is that we have to look at the number 6 layer in there, which is overlooked, which we have to face up to the fact that AI is moving, as are many forms of information technology, and formal regulation can be unduly constraining on it. And some of the good that we can get out of it may be prevented if we move too quickly to cast things in stone and wrap things up in red tape. But co-regulation is available to us. We have relatively few good examples around the place of it in operation. But the point is that there is framework law established. Broad principles are enunciated, which are simply not operational, which do have to be got down to earth in order to be usable by people applying AI. But those codes then need to be negotiated amongst all stakeholder groups, not just the industry. Hence my question in one of the breakout sessions about whether IEEE is going to involve advocates for the various other stakeholder groups, because that's important. The insights need to be there. The participation needs to be there in any socio-technical system. Once we've got code negotiation in place, then we need to apply resources, have enforcement powers as part of the legal framework, and then go ahead and use them. establish obligations and enforce them. There is such a mechanism available which can be practical for industry as well as being, and the organisation seeking to apply AI, as well as valuable to the people who are subject to it. So what I've tried to argue is that AI is here and AI is full of threats. The principles for responsible AI are extremely poor and inadequate, and in any case unenforced. And we have to get the scope of our security analyses sorted out because we have not matured. Contrary to somebody earlier on, I've forgotten, was it you, Pat? The here be dragons, I don't believe is anything way out into the future. The dragons are here now. We've got to achieve active regulation of the application of AI to cybersecurity as in other areas. Thanks very much, Katina.
Thanks so much, Roger. We have time for questions. I'm just going to double check that that's the case. Can we open the floor to reflections on Roger's presentation and also Jordan's? Feel free to enter things in the chat window, raise your hand, and I'll make sure that I can see hands, just in case.
Oops.
Too late
Thanks.
in the day.
Thank you, Matthew Mitka. Yes, people have kids to pick up from daycare and so many other places, as well as the continuation of their work week. Alex Harrington, over to you.
Oh, hi. I just had a question that Jordan, I might just ask that question here. I was wondering about, it's interesting what you see as the role of, and I think, you know, I think this is relevant, Roger, to your talk as well. What's the role of the narratives we create around raising awareness of these issues? We've seen a huge shift from, you know, documentary makers like Michael Moore breaking into the mainstream to shed light on issues. But now it's become very polarized. So there's a lot of mistrust around these sort of stories. How do we reconnect with that and get stories out there? How do we create narratives that get the right information and factual information to people?
I think we've got to recognise the power state, and it's the system sponsors, not so much the developers, although obviously they're part of the pattern, but the people who are paying for the developers to implement technologies. We have to reach them. I agree it's important that the public perceptions be there, that media perceptions not project all powerfulness of, say, Facebook, for example, or Google. Yes, there are framing issues, but a great deal of this is simply down to the question of power. And in business, government, industry, the military, the extent to which participation, socio-technical, the broader set of stakeholders are recognised as being players in the game is very limited. So to me, that's where we have to attack. We have to get the message through that we don't want organisations able to work on the assumptions that they're all powerful and can make decisions on their own or from their own perspectives, with PR dealing with public relations. They need to have people on the inside of the tent. For us to do that, we've actually got to be activists. We've got to get out there on the streets. We've got to throw bricks at organisations. And I say that as a person who runs his own $2 company and has done for 25 years. We have got, us people who purvey technology as I do, have got to be forced to be responsible to the public. We ain't going to do it just because somebody invents the term corporate social responsibility.
Marcus Wigan, your hand was up. We can't hear you, Marcus, just in case you're trying to talk. Roger, can you stop sharing your slides just so we can see?
Yes, I'm trying to find it. I've had...
Sorry. I can force that stuff.
Okay, I've got it.
You got it?
The difficulty is that all of these are procedures of various types, but the whole is, let's say that they come into an operational procedure and somebody clobbers you with them. What's your defense? many AI applications are not readily explainable. So the missing element is an approved validation, which is the equivalent of a standard in other areas of manufacturing. So we need to have something of that kind built into this framework. How can you contest an outcome?
Well, my position is that on the vast majority of these applications, not only can't we, but we won't ever be able to. I keep getting told that, oh, it's an active area of research, explanatory mechanisms for artificial neural networks, and I've yet to see any progress. It's even in laboratory context, let alone in real world applications. So I think we're stuck with that one at the moment. We have to face up, as developers as well as members of the public, we have to face up to the fact that they are going to remain opaque. So the old argument that the computer said it, which was applied even in the days when we did have problem-based and solution-based and rule-based mechanisms, which can provide explanations, we're going to have to confront the unaccountability of any system which incorporates AI elements in decision-making. And that has simply got to be a message that gets through to organizations.
It's still possible to design a validation system which considers the robustness of outcomes within various parameters. So one of the things that I've not seen anywhere is a process for establishing the scope or range or reliability span of an outcome which has been determined by AI or machine learning processes. It's not impossible to do. One of the mechanisms you can use for neural networks is to reduce it to the equivalent matrices if it's a two-level ANN. And that, of course, can be reduced to first order to rules and second order to a bit of a fuzz. But, you know, there are ways of going about it, but it's not been set as a research requirement. How do you validate or establish the robustness? I'll actually add or establish the robustness now.
So on slide 5, which I've taken down, sorry, but that was the one, assumptions implicit in artificial neural networks. I had 7 or 8 bullet points. In effect, what we'd be doing is challenging organizations to declare all of the things that were underlying assumptions in the particular application that they were putting forward. And I think they would quickly come to the point of saying, that's a long list, isn't it? Oh, that's a bit of a worry. Now you ask the question about robustness. What you're doing is reducing the scope within which that particular AI application is justifiable to such a small space, multi-dimensional space, that you'd begin to wonder whether it had any applicability to anything, really. Now, as I say, when you've got, what were my words before? I had to write them down. Simple, structured, stable, non-value laden. To the extent that one is in one of those kinds of application areas, okay, I'm prepared to accept that there's going to be some things done that are going to do some work. Damn it, I'm supervising a PhD student who's endeavoring to do it in a very particular context. But once we move into open textured, value laden, human laden environments, I've really got my doubts that the space can never be small enough that that robustness could be demonstrated.
Non-contestability is one of the tests we should put up for AI applications then.
Yep, I like that.
We've got a comment in the chat, which probably I sparked off. I don't want to actually focus on what I said. I want to focus on what Teresa Anderson said, which was, I believe that sometimes we need to be a little bit of each of these things. We mentioned activism. I talked about deliberation in design. I also talked about taking time and the willingness to deliberate with people like Roger and also Jordan. You've met so many different types of stakeholders. And Roger, you said, you know, you deliberately took your hands off the accelerator because if you had started on the stakeholder mapping, you would have gone with your model that you have designed yourself over many years of research, steeped in socio-technical research. How do we talk to people? Like, must we have everyone at the seat at the table? I tell my students, and many of them are online listening, that we've got to talk. we mentioned, we identified some private entities, about 15, 20 minutes ago. And then we identified some defense arms, and then we identified this kind of stakeholder. And all day we've been talking about this transdisciplinarity. Roger, your approach has been known to many, right? It's quite known. Mine is probably the same. But what about those other people that are sitting in the design workspace, in the embedding of socio-technical principles, and in the not just paying lip service, not doing ethics washing? We've lost Matt Mitka, but he talks about the operationalization of this, that we can prove to you we're doing responsible innovation because look, we've got task-oriented levels of things in AI and cybersecurity and whatever. What's your view, Roger and Jordan, over talking to different stakeholders, how we engage them, why we should engage them, if we should engage them?
The approach that I've taken to that, Katina, in each of the areas of consultancy, research and advocacy has been that you need to speak language that the target audience will understand. And we're talking here about executive managers and developers in the technical fraternity. And risk management is the usual hook that will get through to them. So, okay, we're value loading it in the sense that we're seeing it from the organization's side, but at least we're talking their language fitting within their models. Now, the problem is that risk management, when it's conducted within a single organization, is conducted solely from the perspective of that stakeholder, plus any other stakeholder that is big enough that it could scupper our project. So either we've got to convince organizations that they've got to think about the little guys as well, because in total, they might be able to scupper the project. Or alternatively, we've got to get them to appreciate that they actually have obligations of a CSR kind, of a business ethics kind. And that's been a big call. We've only been trying to do it 50 or 70 years. Hasn't worked yet. So we're stuck in that bind. So I think we've got to find the languages to speak to the different levels within organizations to cause them to think that participation, that socio-technical perspectives have payback for the organization as well as for society as a whole. I'm not often successful with my clients when I use it as a consultant, but not never. I have had occasions when that's been listened to, when it's been framed the right way.
Jordan, what about you, with all the people you've met all over the world with your films and your filmmaking? Germany, you've gone to so many different countries.
I mean, I definitely echo all of what Roger's saying there. I think we need to, speak the language to various institutions that need to have conversation. I also feel that there's a heavy emphasis on conversation. And when we talk about filmmaking, my thoughts are that we live in a media-saturated environment. There's so much information. Cutting through is even one of the challenges of our time. But perhaps more important to me as an activist is, the talking and doing advocacy with various social institutions is very important. I've done work with Victoria Police to open up with an activist group, a grassroots activist group, to find out what's going on in the area with facial recognition being used against activists. Clearview AI was a topic of discussion last year. So I guess where I'm trying to go with my point here is I think that we need it all. We need people doing advocacy with social institutions. We need people doing awareness raising and proselytizing with information. We need lively discussions, but we also need people just acting, and doing anything. We've got a lot of talk, but not much do. So perhaps my emphasis on the activist end would just be to get out there and do something. If there's a campaign to stop, say, artificial intelligence being used to discriminate against your job application, or what was an example that was used earlier today? I heard someone speaking about how during COVID, people's academic scores were being decided based on the postcode they were living in during lockdown. So there are so many different things that you can take with and run with, and so much good work out there that's already being done in a bunch of different spaces. You've just got to get out there and support it. But yeah, I struggle with this on a daily basis. It's my existential crisis, you know, being in the media environment that is very saturated right now and doesn't have much. I'm not saying that it doesn't have any efficacy, but definitely I think we're at the stage of crisis now with just how much power we've given away to technology, and just how much technology runs the culture, that it's a time for acting. It's a time for doing anything and everything. And obviously having conversations along the way is important, but yeah, definitely a time for doing.
Any last question to Roger or Jordan from the floor? I'm going to thank you both again. Roger, I know you've been here all day. Jordan, you've been popping in and out every second that you have been able to from your work life. We are so appreciative of your time. I'm going to stop the recording here, and we're going